Hello, my name is Connor.
And I'm Jason.
And you are listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast.
So as we continue to walk with Jesus, looking over his shoulder, I just want to acknowledge that chronology is a challenging thing. You may know that Matthew, Mark, Luke are called the synoptic gospels, which gives a sense of the same. It's not the same. It means they're told from in a very similar way in terms of the pacing of Jesus' ministry. Whereas John, there's just a lot of things. It's difficult to tell if it's even told in chronological order, if it's told more in conceptual order. Like John is making a case for presenting Jesus in all these ways, and he's really focused on the last week of Jesus' life. He's really focused on that, whereas the others, it's much more of a recording of his history. And so, anyway, I'm going to go ahead and just own I did this a few years ago, and I've looked back on that, like put it in chronological order, and I'm super critical of that guy, what a dummy that guy was. And my assumption is the way we're processing through now, I'll do the same in a month or a year. And I think, you have these different people writing to different audiences, meaning Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they're not seeing exactly the same thing. Luke wasn't even there, but it was, and Mark wasn't there, right? Am I thinking right now? Yeah, Matthew's the only one that was there, and then John was there. And so they're seeing him through different, and them not being there doesn't mean it's not true. Matter of fact, a person telling from firsthand and solely relying on his own perspective might not catch a lot of details that a guy that was investigating it, like Luke says he does. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, the point in all this is I don't think it's super critical we get it in order. I am thinking in terms of conceptually as his ministry develops, keeping like things together, like this probably happened during this phase and this next thing happened during that phase, because I think that's the usefulness of it. But anybody could do it in any number of ways, and I'd be like, yeah, I get that too.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair, and I think it also even the kind of acknowledging that, hey, this version. We'll probably look back and have a different perspective a couple years from now, and so on and so forth. I think it's really helpful to think about how we storytell in general. If there is something big that happened in my life, I'm going to tell people about it now differently than I will a couple years from now, because it'll have different meanings, it'll have different ways of hitting me. I will definitely talk about it in a different way to a different audience. This is something that we all do without even thinking about it often. And so I think it's helpful for us, again, this is part of the giving dignity, to recognize when there are these, we're not exactly sure how the stories are lining up, when it isn't looking exactly like a textbook. I think it's giving both the actual text and the people in the text and the people who wrote the text, giving them dignity to go, yeah, these, of course there are these small differences in these ways. Of course the presentation is a little bit different and a little bit muddled, because that is just how humanity is. You can find any instance of some event happening, and there can be video evidence of it, but if you go talk to a few different people, you're going to get different ways that story was told. And so I think, one, that's the beauty of why we have all these different presentations of the life of Jesus, is because I think it's so incredibly helpful to see Jesus through the literary eyes of these different observers. And yeah, I think it's just a helpful reminder to take us back to the humanity of Jesus.
I think that's really good. And I was even thinking, I tell stories different now than I did 5 years ago, than 10 years ago. But if I tell the same story to 3 different groups, I will subconsciously modify it to how I think the other group will appreciate it. I have stories from military that if I'm telling military people, I will include details that I just won't include from primarily civilian audiences. And it's not because I'm such a deep military guy. It just, I'm watching and I'm immediately adjusting to that audience. And I think that's really important. I also think it'd be fascinating, and this may have been done already, but if you were to discipline yourself and say, I'm going to give a biography of Jesus solely based on Mark, solely based on John, solely based on here's the kind of man he was, solely based on this. We're not reading anything else, no prophecies, nothing else. I think it'd be really fascinating to compare. And if that same author did the same thing, of course, it'd be so hard to discipline yourself. But I think that'd be fascinating because it would be shocking how different he was. And I think that's how he shows up to me. I think if I said every single thing I think about Jesus and put it in a really cohesive, concise story form, and you did the same, I think a third reader would be like, oh, okay, why didn't you include this?
Of course, yeah.
And I think this is I think this is the design. I think that's why I don't know if it's why he designed us different, but the fact that he designed us different, I think we should expect him to connect different to you than to me, which is why it's so valuable for the body for believers to come together, whether it's like this or whether it's in big groups, because that's part of why we do that is I want to hear how you're engaging with Jesus, because that's a whole different way than I am. Now, it may seem subtle at first, but the more you process, you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
That gives me a whole different take on him.
Well, it's really fascinating because we know this with our personal relationships. Like, obviously, Jason and I have a very close relationship, but like we interact with each other and have a different angle of our relationship than I do with my wife, than I do with other friends, than I do with coworkers, whatever it may be. And so there are all these different angles that people around us know us to be. And all of them are a part of us, right? And we have this tendency, I think, with Jesus to be like, okay, we got the God angle, then we got the human angle. And when you actually begin to think about, okay, what does that mean in my limited state of connecting with Jesus and my limited ability to do so? Like I am oftentimes only going to catch a glimpse, because even the people that I know and love the most, like as a human, I still don't understand the full breadth of who they are. I still can't fully get it. And so I think one of the things maybe I struggle to do, let me put some ownership into it. I always want to make sure I recognize the distinct godliness of Jesus, and this distinct humanity, but also forgetting that, like, in that, of all the different angles of who God is and all the different angles of who God is, in the humanity of Jesus, that is so much more, that is so much more complicated than I often give Jesus credit for. And sometimes I think early on in my faith, you would read something about Jesus and you'd be like, oh, Jesus is this way. And then you read something where he does something in a seemingly opposite way. And you go, what the heck? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, and it almost would be like, is there a problem with the text? This doesn't seem coherent. But then, and again, there's some different answers that I think a lot of times for me, what the answer came back to, Jesus was a person. And there was this time in this place where he reacted to stimuli in this way. And then several weeks later, this other thing happened, and I'm like, well, of course, if I recognize Jesus as human, then that's going to be a given that's going to happen. And I think a lot of times I have not given the dignity to Jesus to recognize that.
I think that's fascinating. And another thing that jumps out at me is when it says he learned obedience from what he suffered. I think that's an ongoing suffering, meaning the week you're talking about when he interacts first, then he has suffering between that and the next thing. Well, he's learned some more. And it's hard for us because we're like, well, doesn't he have the mind of God? And I'm like, I would say yes. And then it's like, and there's passage says he learned as he went. I would say yes. And he would say, I only do what the Father tells me to do. And you get the sense this is like, he told me this on Tuesday. Now he's telling me this on Saturday. Now, and so it's fascinating to think of God learning. Mm-hmm. And this raises a whole nother, we could talk about this the whole time, but I think that's interesting to think of these interactions, including the one we're about to cover, as more learning for Jesus, and would he have done what he does? Because he does something really startling, and I'll go ahead and set this context up a bit. We're in Mark chapter 1, verse 40, and if you've ever felt lonely, if you've ever felt, you look around in your circle of friends, you're united in your, I don't know, maybe trauma or pain or isolation. I mean, that's what this story is about. There's a big piece here. If you know much about leprosy in the Bible, and I do not, I consider myself rather amateurish, but it's clear that once it was developed, it was contagious, it was incurable, and so they would have to isolate themselves, even to the point of they would form these places outside of towns and have colonies of sorts, and there still are leper colonies today. And I know we have some people in India that minister to a leper colony, and it's different in terms of certain dynamics, but that isolation, the loneliness, I just think that really speaks to me.
Well, it's not just the physical uncomfortability of being deeply ill and the pain and all the things that come with not being able to with being ill and not being able to get any sort of care and being cast to the margins of society. There's also the spiritual component of going, not only is all this happening to me, not only does my life completely suck, it also must be because I did something wrong or my parents did something wrong. And so to recognize not just that the sickness means my body is broken, but there's something deep inside me that's broken, and this is why this has happened. This is there's some sort of moral failing along the line, and I think it's very clearly what a lot of people suffering with illness at this time would have believed and would have assumed, and that's what society would have reinforced in them. And so that sort of loneliness is even deeper. And I've seen that with people interacting today with homeless people, assuming that not just they fell in some bad times, they didn't get help when they needed to get help, but they deserved it, right? Mm-hmm. It's a similar thing. We do cast the homeless to the edges of our society, and a lot of us, whether subconsciously or some people say it out loud, assume, well, that's because they deserved it, or they did something to be on the outside, and so maybe we don't say that as a society, but I think as a society in the time of Jesus, this would have been something not just underneath, but a main line through. It would have been a main point driven home to people like this man we're going to talk about.
I think that's good, and I think it's good to think of those parallels. It crossed my mind when AIDS first came on. I was in high school when we first started hearing about HIV, and people getting just abused, just simply because they might have it, kind of thing, and I think this is
and how many preachers at the time talked about it as God's sign of judgment against America or whatever it would be.
Yeah, and I think it's just really, and again, we're trying to get our mindset with this leper, flipping it to Jesus. I'm sure he's been taught since he was a little kid, you stay away from people like that. And specifically, they would say, "Don't touch me, unclean, stay away from me." And so that adds another little slice to this reading here. I'm going to start in verse 40 there, and it says, "A man with leprosy came to Jesus, and begged him on his knees, 'If you are willing, you can make me clean.' Jesus was indignant. He reached out his hand and touched the man. 'I am willing,' he said, 'be clean.' Immediately the leprosy left him, and he was cleansed. Jesus sent him away at once with a strong warning. 'See that you don't tell this to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them.' Instead, he went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in lonely places, yet the people still came to him from everywhere." Lots there. Mm-hmm. What strikes you? What's amazing to you about this interaction?
Man, there's a lot here. The fact that God is openly defied, and there's no direct retribution is pretty incredible. But the thing that for me is amazing, and this speaks to Jesus when it talks about how he becomes so famous after this incident, because the man with leprosy is just talking all about it, that he can't even enter and stay in towns. He has to go outside in the lonely places. That is such an interesting insight. Like what exactly does that mean? Does that mean like Jesus literally couldn't go stay in a town because 24/7 he'd be asked to do things and he would literally never get sleep? Is that a personal introverted nature of Jesus being like, I can't be the center 100% of the time. I can't be the life of the party 100%. I don't know exactly why this is, but I think it is always compelling to me, especially, we live in a day and age, like churches are designed by extroverts for extroverts. I think it's always important to remind ourselves that there are plenty of times where Jesus is with the crowd, he's talking with them. There's so many more times where Jesus is withdrawing, needing to get away, and both of those are completely valid and honored by our Savior.
Yeah, I think we would totally redo our relationship with God if we were taught early on, look, first, you connect with God, and then second, you connect with people. But because most people meet God through people, which how else could you do that? And specifically through church structure, which is a whole different thing than just meeting him through casual conversation with people. I don't know if we really realize until we do good analysis. For a lot of people, that's in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, when they're like, wait a minute, I don't like this. And then they're like, well, is it about God or is it about the people or the system you were given that was called God? And that's why I think it's really important at young ages to be able to entertain these conversations and make it safe to ask whatever questions on your mind. But I do think it's fascinating. It's one of those things that you're like, well, wait a minute, Jesus, couldn't you keep entering cities and just set better boundaries? You know, and I think it's really beautiful. I'm going to go ahead and say this: the limitation of his ability to control the situation around him. To think about God in the flesh is fascinating when you think of what God can do. Like, it's weird. On one hand, I think of Jesus as so high because he's God. But once I put him in flesh, I'm like, well, of course he can't control that. I'm like, well, hold on. If he's God, can he not control how the people do? I mean, he can't even control this guy that he healed. I mean, you know, it's one thing for the religious leaders to not do what he says. It's quite another thing for him to say, look, I just changed everything about your world. You know, and we can excuse this guy. He's really excited. He thought his whole outlook, you know, I don't know how long he'd had leprosy or how old he was, but I mean, if he's in his 30s, he's got like 4 more years of life in Jerusalem. Yeah, but I mean, if he's in his 20s, you know, he's got maybe 20 more years as life expectancy that everybody in a Jewish person would think, man, yeah, I've got a big life now. So I get it. But you would just think, and the words, there are a couple words here that are interesting, but for this purpose, where it says that he is very much sternly warning him, you know, that idea, strong warning, you know, and I'm like, if Jesus speaks with authority in these other situations, I would assume he's speaking with authority here, and now it's adding, you know, strong, all it had to say was he went away once with a warning, that would be enough, but a strong warning. And it's like he can't help himself, which is at one point from a and we've made this point many, many times, but this is just another example. On one point, it's like, what is Jesus' deal? Like on one hand, he's like, yeah, I want everybody to come to me, but I don't want you to tell about it. You know, so that's weird. And this does give you a sense of what Jesus was thinking. Had you not told people that I could heal leprosy and this more provocative aspect of my ministry, then, you know, this would have made this part easier. Yeah. But it's fascinating. All of a sudden, Jesus is micromanaging. I think that's what I want to get to is generally he's like, yeah, whatever. We're just rolling with this. And all of a sudden he's like, no, I want to control this element. It just seems, it's just funny to me.
Yeah, no, it is unbelievably interesting. And I think about, God is all powerful, but even in this, there's almost an honoring of the free will of everybody else. Because you go, okay, could angels, like if he were to enter into a town, could angels disperse the people and make it so he's not crowded? Could Jesus summon these bodyguards to make sure that, you know, he could do this? And yet even in Jesus going off into the lonely places and Jesus, and, you know, not inserting himself in these situations, it's almost still honoring the other people he's living with free will, while still trying to exercise his own will and his own desire, and how these two are at play is so fascinating. I guess I never thought about it in that way. The will of Jesus here, again, you think about it with like the Pharisees and like the big will of the Pharisees and the religious leaders of the day, but here you run into the will of Jesus versus the will of just an everyday man who was sick and now is not, and Jesus is okay ultimately. Like we don't get a John Wick scenario where he tracks this man down and, you know, and gets mad at him for doing it. Jesus has a will for this man. This man rejects it, and, you know, there's no smiting, there's no anger, there's no, you know, whatever. It's just like, hey, here's the consequences. I was trying to do this, I wanted my will was this, and a human rejected that will, and here are the consequences of rejecting my will.
Yeah, no, I think that is amazing. The other piece that I pick up on, and I could honestly include this in Perplexing as well, but when he's talking to him about I don't know, I was about to say cover up, but it's not a cover up. He's like, hey, here's how I want to do this. He's like, I want you to go to the priest now for the sacrifices, and just, you know, from what I know, in general, if they thought you had leprosy, and you'd have to stay for a certain amount of time, and then if it didn't spread, like if you had this spot or whatever, some symptom of it, you'd have to be isolated. Then you'd come if it didn't grow, and you'd go to the priest. And so I find it fascinating. He's like wanting to help him slip back into society. You know, he's wanting him not to run around and say, hey, look what happened. You know, he wanted him to go and get the seal of approval and kind of slide it back in. And there are several times I'm thinking in the history where God very much works in not simply the free will of the individual, but also the cultural pattern. And I think we can make this case with Jesus. It's like, why is he waiting till he's 30? And why is he only staying in this one area? And wouldn't it have been beneficial had he gone to the Americas in the 19... No, I'm just kidding. But when, I mean...
Do you want me to take that out?
Yeah. That's
it's
fine.
going in.
It's going. But I mean, I can just think of 20 ways to do it better. I mean, I think, just with people with marginal theological knowledge like me, if we came together, we'd be like, here's 20 ways to do this better, Jesus. And it's like, okay, but he really honors not all of it, because clearly Sabbath, it's like he really targets their belief on Sabbath, not the Sabbath itself, but their belief on Sabbath. But here he's like, yeah, let's honor this piece and go back in and go to the priest, because it's just as funny. There's something... If it wasn't Jesus, I think, well, this is kind of deceptive.
Well, and I think it gets to a lot of times how we interact with Jesus is Jesus came to reset the rules. Jesus came to give us the complete better guideline, the way to walk the path. And I think that is true. I think that's why Jesus came. But I think that the actual path that Jesus wants us to walk is not the path that says to the left you have this bad doctrine, to the right you have this bad doctrine. Now keep going forward with your eyes closed, or you're only focused on me. I think the way that people assume that Jesus lived was Jesus said all these things. Jesus interacted because his intention was, here's how my doctrine will play out in the church 2,000 years from now. And that's just not how he lived, because no human could possibly live that way. Now, I do think Jesus, even in those moments, was thinking about the future and had thoughts and ultimately had plans, and God was working it for our benefit and our teaching 2,000 years later. But our assumption is in these interactions is that Jesus, when he's healing this man with leprosy, has some deep intention to lay down doctrine for us 2,000 years later. And maybe sometimes that's the case. Other times, maybe we're just getting a glimpse of God and a glimpse of what God is doing in this moment. And that in of itself is a sort of doctrine, is a way to live by. But it's not a yes and it's not a no. It's not a rule book where we can easily check it off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that raised a whole another thing, that thought of Jesus thinking, okay, I'm doing this with the leper, and I would say probably he's not thinking this way, but he could be, okay, so in the future, this time I want all Christ followers to handle lepers, or anybody with really contagious, debilitating diseases, you know? And it's funny, the church didn't run with that one necessarily. Now, they did historically minister to lepers, but not a lot of the touching, and I think it's fascinating, I'll get to that in a second, that whole touching piece.
Yeah.
But that idea specifically about thinking, having a vision for how it's going to play out, and we're very egocentric. Like I usually, when I think about this, I'm thinking, when I say how it's going to play out, I don't think, how's it playing out for 17th century, Eastern Europe. I think about how it's playing out for me right now. And I feel downright visionary to imagine what the church is going to be like when my grandkids are part of it. But Jesus, when we say Jesus, what's he really thinking about the future? We can't just say, like, America in my lifetime or wherever you live in your lifetime. We got to think the whole world. And I spend so little time thinking about, how's the church in France handling this? Like the guy in France right now that's reading this and whatever's happening there, or Ethiopia or wherever,
Well, and I think it gets to, like, if you try to lift this and say, okay, so what are the rules when I run into somebody with leprosy or a similar station of life? What are the exact rules? Okay, I've got this exact situation, Jesus, so I have a rule book now to handle it. And you go, yeah, maybe. I think honestly, if you're going to do anything like exactly like Jesus would, this is probably like maybe like you won't have the authority to heal in this exact circumstance, but the way that he loves and comforts and is not afraid of this person is 100% valid way to handle this sort of situation. But I think you look at what is Jesus doing in this circumstance? Yes, he's healing. Yes, he is re-altering maybe this man's perspective, and anybody who sees him do this, their expectation for the unclean and the impure in their society. But ultimately what he's doing is he's loving the person right in front of them. And what love for this person, what love looks like for this man with leprosy 2,000 years ago might even look a little bit different for what love for the homeless person who struggles with their mental health looks like for me later on today. And again, we can justify a lot away by this, but I think it's just that constant reminder that the thing that Jesus is doing, what he is doing is he's loving the person in front of them. And he's not loving them because it's going to be a great lesson for us 2,000 years from now. He's loving them because he loves them.
I think, and I think that is really powerful. And my takeaway would always, with this type of interaction in particular, be, wow, I don't think he was thinking 10 minutes earlier, man, I hope I find a leper today, and I hope I can put my hands on him. And I think that's a lot of times how we think we've got to be to prepare ourselves for the day. I'm going to meet this person and do this thing. And then life never goes that way, of course. And then you feel really guilty because you're like, oh man, I ended up staying in my office all day, or ended up whatever it is, you know, my car broke down. And my big act of faithfulness was not cussing out anyone today or turning to violence when I got really frustrated. And I think that's the real important piece is this, and every example of interacts with Jesus is him saying, okay, God, I love you, so I'm trusting you with this. What does this other person made in your image need? Mm-hmm. And guide me into that, you know, which leads me, I'm going to jump to what perplexes me. It's interesting in the NIV, this translation at least, this version of the NIV, in verse 41, it says Jesus was indignant. And if you go to the footnote, it's also filled with compassion. Now, we would read that as two opposite things. Like, say, how did you feel when this happened? You're like, I'm indignant. And then the person next to you says, well, I felt a lot of compassion. You'd be like, well, you're on the opposite end of the spectrum, you know, because I read indignant as angry and like righteous anger. And to think about how it's both, and I've got an answer. I'm not going to pop quiz you on this, but it doesn't mean I'm right. And so you may have very, very different perspective. My understanding is this word, it's the same Greek word, and how it's expressed deals with context. And this is typical with a lot of Greek words, you know, but how it's expressed is context, and how it can show up as compassion is you're so troubled, righteously troubled in your gut, you know, that it's expressed as care. And to translate as indignant means the same thing. You're so troubled in your gut, you're gonna push back with power. Mm-hmm. So it's really fascinating here that these translators, this group of translators, they felt like Jesus is, it's the same Greek word, keep in mind, but I think one group can read it where he's acting out of his power to say this should not be. Now, what shouldn't be? The isolation, leprosy's existence, you know, back in the garden there was no disease, and now sin entered the world, now we have disease. Who knows exactly what his focus is? Maybe there's an audience that we're not aware of that's like, it's another one of those tests, you know, don't test him, because that comes up specifically later in another situation of healing. Or is it simply, are they off in this a little bit and it's more compassion? But it is this fascinating compulsion that Jesus feels, or spirit ledness, to touch him, because he heals other lepers. Like there's a group of 10 lepers he'll heal, doesn't touch anybody. Mm-hmm. You know, and we always focus on 9 left and 1 came back and said thank you. But there's also the point that he didn't touch anybody. Like he can touch people without even seeing them. And so the fact that he did this, it's still, that's the part where I struggle sometimes with Jesus, is like, you know, it's like, hey, I'm trying to think of some parallel. I don't know what it would be, but it's like some risk-taking behavior to participate in really connecting with this people. Like if you're trying to reach out to drug addicts, how many drugs should you take to make the point that you're for them? Now, we would think that's insanely ridiculous. We wouldn't do that. And I'm not advocating it. I'm not saying it is. But if you'd come to me without this story and said, how much should you embrace, you know, a leper, like physically, before you heal them? And I'd be like, well, I know that when it's 0, it's so 0, it's 0, 0, you know? And I think that's the rub here. And this goes back to what I was saying before. How do I apply this? Yeah. You know, now the general, apply it with love, but then getting into the specifics, how much risk should I take in showing people the love of God?
So there's this interesting, and I'm not up to date with the current status of this. Maybe you probably would know what the current status of this is better than me. But I know in our town, there's a organization that works with the homeless, and they had been looking to do tiny homes. And most people probably know what I'm talking about within the sound of my voice. They were looking to do tiny homes for the homeless, and they got all this funding, and they were trying to find a place to do it. And they kept running into the situation where every time they wanted to place this amazing facility down to help homeless people, the local people that would become their neighbors threw themselves in front of it and wanted to block it because it made them feel unsafe. Their property's values would go down, whatever the issue would be. And it was something that made the news even a few times. And I don't know what the current status of that is at all. But there is that similar feel. I can't exactly explain why it feels similar to this story and exactly what you were talking about. But oftentimes, it's easy to feel compassion for somebody. You see somebody suffering. It's easy to feel anger that somebody's suffering, but pairing those two together to allow my anger at the fact that there is homelessness and there are people who need desperate help, that they are not getting that help, and feel compassion that they should have it, to move that to the action where I'd be okay with giving up property value or giving up some safe feeling of personal safety, that takes a move of God, and that takes being real and honest. And I think that when we've touched a little bit on in the course of our recordings what social justice can be and what it is as a follower of Jesus, and what place it should have in our life. And I think this is the place for me where I've settled, where I would love broad societal changes, right? That helps things get better. And I'll vote for those things or push for those things when I get the opportunity to. But the most important thing is that it comes personally for me first, that I'm willing to give up some safety. I'm willing to give up that my indignation at somebody's suffering and their pain would drive me to such great compassion that I would be willing to risk not just somebody else's tax dollars, but put some of my own stake in it.
I think that it's so salient for me, because yesterday I'm eating lunch with a guy that is running this amazing ministry. And it started as one thing, but they were really committed to this neighborhood. Well, then as they got into the neighborhood, they're like, oh, there's a ton of sex trafficking that's going on here, and there's strip clubs here, and how do we minister to people? And then just praying, and then God gives them this connection, that connection. And I'm listening to these stories. I'm like, that's fantastic. Then I realize the church that we're building, the church that we're planning to plant, it's located like a block off where he's at. And I want to build a wall, like conceptually, where I'm like, you're doing so good in your neighborhood, but I wouldn't have access to that, So it's this funny thing that I love hearing the stories of, man, these people bless these drug addicts, homeless people, whatever it is. And I'm not equating those. I'm just saying difficult life situations. But they come in and they're so blessing to them. I only want to touch that story or be involved in that story at the end.
Yeah.
Where they're sharing the testimony and they're like, and I've been sober for this amount of time, or I've had my own house for this amount of time. And it's Nimbus is the phrase, not in my backyard. I heard this morning, and it's that idea. And the people, sadly, the people that were the most aggressive towards this homeless ministry were not just kind of Christians. I mean, these were many times church leaders in their local churches. Now, I think they have found a property. I think they are doing good. And keep in mind, they weren't asking for the property to be donated. They already had been given the property, and so, but the fact that piece of that property would be near, not even up against, but near their property, it drew a lot of ire. And it's so easier for me to be like, oh, shame on them. Mm-hmm. But then I'm like, yeah, shame on me. I think I would be there too.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's good to have the conversations to prepare yourself to go, like, it might not be a homeless ministry that pops up next to you that costs you. It might be something completely different. There's a trail that runs by our house. There's like some drainage canals or whatever. And Hannah and I have lived here for 5-6 years now, and we've walked this trail forever. And a lot more homeless people have popped up in the wooded areas near the trails. And we've talked about it, and like we feel like less safe. And there are precautions we take. Like we'll take pepper spray because I had to call 911 a couple of times. And we could find ourselves getting very frustrated with it. But then just the other day, we saw another area that had been a forested area where some homeless people were living the forest was being cut down. The little forested area was being cut down. And I was like, oh, shame on them. But then how many times have I been on my walk, been like, man, something's got to be done about this. And again, I've never been mean or whatever towards anybody I've ever met on that trail. But still, that feeling deep in my heart and something I have to constantly be comparing to, and not allowing myself to not allowing myself to talk myself out of it. Because a lot of times that initial judgment to go, oh man, I think like I'll feel that, oh man, I'm being this version of myself I don't want to be. And then if I give myself time, I can always justify it, and I can always figure out why my denial of the movement of God is actually the correct version, as the intellectual is the safe version, where you get this interaction. And I love when these sort of things pop up, because the immediacy of this man begging Jesus, there's no pre-preparation. Like it's this like if there had been a meeting beforehand or later on with his disciples, like, okay, so it looks like on the docket we have 5 healings today, one very highly contagious disease, so we can maybe have a separate little pardoned off area, but the immediacy for which Jesus lives life is so I don't think it's an accident. I don't think it's an accident that so much of the time the interactions that Jesus has with people are immediate, don't even give you that chance. Maybe it doesn't even give that chance for somebody else to intervene and throw themselves in the way of God moving. And yeah, how this looks personally for me is going to look completely different for you and for anybody else. But I think I think most of us know when we think about it. Okay, I think this is an area of my life where this is happening.
Mm-hmm. I think that's well said. And I oftentimes when we have a epiphany and we're aware, man, I really need to love people more actively and things like that. I think part of our just self-assessment is exactly what you're saying. How many times do I feel an impulse to do something, and then I spend all of my energy talking myself out of it?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and whether, and this goes back to where this started, whether he's acting whether indignant or compassion is the better word here. The fact is he showed compassion based on his sense of injustice. And so I'm like, okay, how do I clarify my life? And I'm going to be generous to myself. And my first question, I'm working on my first question not being how do I get out of this? You know, because that's often my first question I ask myself. Can I start to shift to my first question is, God, what do you want here? What's the most loving thing? And that doesn't create anything immediately, but it does start seeding the ground for God to have more space in my life to respond.
Yeah, that's so fantastic. I think there are so many valid questions. Like, it's valid when you think about, man, like, we have this one property, and like it matters to my family and to my kids, and like, you know, what is it gonna, like, that there are so many questions that are good questions, responsible questions to ask ourselves in any given situation. But if those can all be filtered by the first question of, well, what is God doing? What does God want from me? What can I do for God? Then not only does that that first question like reveal a lot of answers, it also helps how you ask the remaining questions you need to ask.
That's absolutely true. Absolutely. And that's what God's looking for. He's not, and I want to always be clear on this, he's not saying, will Jason, will Connor, will whoever do the right thing in this situation? He's asking, will you trust me with this situation and let me lead you and not allow your fears to front load it so much that you don't even ask me at all?
Yeah.
So I'm curious, what hits you that's perplexing?
I'll wrap up. I'll do mine pretty quickly because we are running up against our time that we've assigned that nobody holds us to. What's funny to me is you have this man who is sick and who's been cast to the edges of society, and he runs up to this teacher, right? He runs up to this teacher and does all but demand to be healed. And then Jesus asks this very bold man, like the boldness for this man to come up to Jesus. Jesus asks him to be quiet and silent. And it goes like, man, that almost seems like the very limited amount of knowledge we have of this man. Like, that's the last thing that like this guy seems like he would do. Right. And again, like what is the motive for Jesus asking? Like, is it more for the man? Is it more for himself, for the ministry, for the people that he'll talk to? Just what deep down is the motive? Because like, again, this can be a little bit of analysis after the fact. But he does not seem like the kind of guy who is going to just quietly, go about the rest of his life. He seems like the kind of guy, if he's bold enough to go to a teacher for this sort of healing, then he's probably going to be pretty bold after that. And so you just go, man, what? Again, it can be the answer can be threefold, in terms of who this is for. But yeah, you just want to go in Jesus' mind in the moment. What was his purpose in not wanting him to go about telling about his experience?
Yeah, well, and you could read this that why Jesus was indignant is because he says, if you're willing. Mm-hmm. And if Jesus is frustrated by that, which I don't know, but if he is, how did he want him to say it? Make me clean? Please make me clean? Make me clean right now? It's fascinating. And I don't know, that's the point. And which then raises the question, for the stuff I want to change in my life and my heart, how do I ask? Am I asking? Is part of my asking? Yeah, I mean, because he shows such compassion to the man, it's similar to where the guy says, hey, will you cast the demon out of my son if you're able? And he says, if I'm able. He's like, I believe, help my unbelief. And Jesus still heals the kid. He doesn't say, hey, you get to believe and then I'll heal your son. I don't know. It's just fascinating. And I guess my takeaway is, it's what we've said several times, but it's that idea of God is going to lead me. The Spirit is going to lead me in a different way than I suppose. And my response, if I want to be leadable, is to say, God, I believe you have a plan with this, no matter how small this interaction is. Help me to be faithful.
Yeah. And I would even encourage you when you're asking God for that. So many of the times when people ask for healing from Jesus, or people ask Jesus for something in general, they don't give a qualifier. They don't let Jesus off the hook. Like this man gives space for Jesus to say no to his healing. But he goes to him for the healing. He's making Jesus come through for him or not. And I think sometimes we need to be reminded that Jesus is not afraid of not being held accountable. It's not the right phrasing that I'm going for. But Jesus is not afraid of our direct asks. And I think a lot of times we are afraid of direct asking and of allowing God to seemingly disappoint us. And so I just want to encourage you, for the next 2 hours after you happen to listen to this, be bold with God, bold with your asking. And maybe that isn't necessarily that you would win the lottery, but just be bold. Allow God the possibility of disappointing you. Allow Jesus the possibility of not coming through, because if you hold Jesus arm's length, then you only ask him for things that you could probably get by with if it doesn't come through. Then you're artificially limiting how close you can get with Jesus, and that's just a major bummer. Thank you for listening. Grace, peace, and love.